Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin shortly. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are honored to be joined today by Nickolay Mladenov, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. There are few people today anywhere more knowledgeable about what is going on in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza, as well as the surrounding region. AJC has known him for many years, beginning with his tenure as Foreign Minister of Bulgaria when he became a close friend. After we hear from Mr. Mladenov, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That's questions plural. David, Mr. Mladenov, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today for AJC's Advocacy Anywhere program. And for me, it's a very special pleasure to be with a very dear friend of ours and of mine, Nickolay Mladenov, whom, as Daniel said, we first got to know as Foreign Minister of Bulgaria, who then came to the American Jewish Committee Global Forum and gave one of the most profound and meaningful speeches that I can recall in our decades-long history. And today, as you heard, he is the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for the Middle East Peace Process. So Nikki, just to begin the conversation and to frame it, perhaps you could explain to our listening audience worldwide, what exactly does that mean to be the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for what is called Middle East Peace Process? What does that mean on a daily, practical basis?
Hi, David, and thank you, AJC, for having me here. Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem. We are not working on some strange frozen UN time that will always stay at, what is it, almost 5:45. This is just a virtual background behind me, otherwise you'd see my daughter's bedroom. What it means to be the UN Special Envoy for the Middle East peace process means to be always getting this question and never having a very clear answer to it, because there is really no peace process happening as we speak. It hasn't been happening for a long period of time. So my understanding is that actually our role right now is really to keep the peace. And keeping the peace means focusing on what needs to be done to revive a process between the Israelis and the Palestinians to achieve sustainable final status arrangement, hopefully based on the two-state solution, but also means preventing war. And in the Middle East, in the region where we live today, that is pretty much taking up a lot of our time. And that effectively and practically means focusing a lot on Gaza and preventing another escalation in Gaza, currently working both with the Israelis and the Palestinians on the COVID response plans that we're putting together to try and prevent a major outbreak of the disease. And last but not least, reaching out to the region, because to me, any peaceful arrangement for the future, first and foremost, needs to involve the region. Israel, the Arab partners in the Gulf and in the entire Middle East, those who are committed to tolerance and want to support democracy and want to support inclusion rather than those who support radicalism. All of us need to come together and create the foundations for a stable peace in the region. Just as this crisis started, myself and a few of my colleagues from working in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, we issued a joint appeal to the leadership and to the leaders of the whole Middle East that now is the time for everyone to put their guns down, to put their conflicts aside, to reach across conflict lines, to focus on the opportunities that the virus actually creates for cooperation, and resolve some of these long conflicts that have been with us for such a long time. So we're kind of inventing it as we go, what this job means, but it is what actually, if I have to summarize it, it is about helping keep the peace in the region.
The title, and you and I have discussed this before, Nikki, is Middle East Peace Process. But what we're really talking about, to be clear for our audience, is peace between Israel and the Palestinians and the larger Arab world. Is that correct? Or does it entail other responsibilities in the region?
That's most of it. In fact, I've often gotten the question when people see my business card, they say, which Middle East peace process? Is it the Yemeni? Is it the Syrian? Is it the Palestinian? Is it the Iraqi? Because there's a lot of need for peace processes in this part of the world. But most of our focus is on the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, and hopefully putting together a settlement that allows both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people to live in homes of their own in peace and security. That's the goal.
So I'm sure that one of the big questions on the minds of everyone watching us from around the world is the following, and you've already made some reference to it. Can in some way this pandemic remind the parties to the conflict that they have common threats? And can a common response to those threats bring the parties closer together? Or not? So in the case of Israel and the Palestinians, any hope?
You know, this virus is such a threat to all of us and it doesn't obviously recognize any borders or nationalities, that it is, in fact, the one thing that everybody can come around to fighting together. And it has created, strangely enough, some very interesting opportunities. We've seen over the last few weeks the level of cooperation and coordination between the Israelis and the Palestinians rise to unprecedented levels. Obviously, if you look at the politics of it, that has not been the case, because still there are major political differences as to the future of the peace process. But at the level of health services, security, financial issues, dealing with the economic fallout of the crisis, we've seen unprecedented levels of coordination. And this is evident for I live in Jerusalem, so for, I don't know, the people who are watching this podcast, whether they're here or in America or elsewhere, but for those of us who are here, we know how extensive the closures that have been imposed by the health authorities have been. But these closures have been very well coordinated between the Israeli health authorities and the Palestinian health authorities. So this is one of the major factors in preventing the spread of the disease. We've seen also a very serious attempt still to focus on what comes after the virus, because the virus and the health crisis that it creates is just one aspect of it, but the economic fallout, the social economic fallout will be major. And let me just give you a very quick example of what I'm talking about. We did some analysis a couple of weeks ago, and the GDP decline in the West Bank for the Palestinians is currently standing at some 2% per month. Their tourism industry, as the tourism industry everywhere, has disappeared. Now, Israel's economy is much stronger, way stronger than the Palestinian economy. But, and the Palestinian economy is supported to a large extent by people who work in Israel and transfer money from their salaries, et cetera, to their families in the West Bank. And these incomes have been lost. So we're looking at the possibility that within 3 to 4 months, if the situation remains as is, the Palestinian situation will just collapse economically because of lack of liquidity in the system. And Israel has stepped in, and there have been some very constructive discussions between the ministers of finance in Ramallah and Israel, and they've reached agreement on putting together a package that would ensure that the Palestinian government services in the West Bank and hopefully in Gaza receive some support from Israel, financial, that ensures their sustainability. Now, this is a major breakthrough because this hasn't happened ever in the past to the extent that it's happening now. And this is because of the joint recognition that you have a common threat which affects everyone. And if we look briefly to Gaza, we've also seen Israel facilitate extensive and support extensive amounts of health materials, tests, etc., going into the Gaza Strip to prevent the outbreak of the virus there. And that's something I'd like to speak to a little bit later, in more detail, because I think it's quite a fascinating story. But so outside of the realms of politics, we've seen this tremendous cooperation on the ground, which is extremely important, and it actually goes beyond just the environment here. It reaches across with Jordan and with Egypt and with the other parts of the Middle East where this cooperation is now very much necessary. So yes, it does create opportunities. Now I'm hoping that somehow the political leaders on both sides will see this as an opportunity on which to build towards creating peace and a final status arrangement. However, I'm not excited that the political leaders on both sides see it this way, given where domestic politics in Israel and among the Palestinians are heading.
So let's get to politics in a moment, but you mentioned Gaza, and you're one of the few people I know who was able, outside the pandemic, outside the home quarantine, to be able to travel to Gaza and then to come back to Jerusalem and to interact with the Gaza authorities, the West Bank authorities, and of course the Israeli authorities. What light can you shed for our audience about the situation in Gaza immediately and more generally?
Well, look, before the pandemic hit us, we were involved in a very complex effort with Israel, with the people who control Gaza, and with the Egyptians to put in place an arrangement that keeps the place from blowing up and prevents another war. And that had been most of the focus of our work for the last 2 weeks. And I'm glad to say that it is because we did that together that we were able to prevent another escalation in Gaza, that today, when the virus arrives, we're able to also see some forms of cooperation that are positive for the people living inside Gaza and for the Israeli communities living on the other side of the border. In Gaza, you have 2 million people who live in the second most densely populated place on the planet, with probably one of the worst healthcare systems in the world. A healthcare system that has been chronically underfunded, chronically undersupported for more than a decade. And to imagine, can you just imagine what would happen if this virus were to reach that small piece of land so densely populated, and the amount of damage that it can cause? So a lot of our focus over the last 3 weeks in particular has been on putting in place basic prevention mechanisms inside Gaza to be able to make sure that the virus doesn't spread. And I must say that what we've seen is some really, really smart people inside the Gaza Strip, particularly along the health services, who've done quite a remarkable job in keeping the place to, I think, about 10 or 12 currently people infected with the virus. The reason that they've been successful at doing that is because the border with Israel is closed. It closed very early. People can't go in and can't go out. So the border with Egypt remained the main entry point into Gaza. Basically, very large contained quarantine centers were established with whom we work in Gaza. And everyone who comes in from Egypt has to spend not 2, but 3 weeks in a quarantine center before being able to leave home if they're not infected. In fact, a couple of days ago, one person inside one of these quarantine centers managed to escape, and he was caught. His contacts were traced, and that is one of the reasons why his infection wasn't able to spread throughout the strip. Now, I'm not saying that we're out of the safe zone, because there are many factors playing into this. But it is these quarantine centers that have been established in the south that contain very much the virus. Hopefully, it is the over 1 million pieces of various medical equipments and tests and agents for the chemicals and medicines that we've been able to bring in to allow for people to be tested. Still not the entire population in Gaza is obviously tested, only those who have symptoms are being tested. Israel has facilitated all of it. It has facilitated other NGOs to allow them to bring in assistance into Gaza. The Palestinian Authority has chipped in as well from Ramallah. In the last few days, we've seen the first truckloads of medicines arrive into Gaza. So it is again a collective effort to try and prevent it. Now, if we've been able to prevent war, and if we're able to prevent an explosion of the pandemic, I think we're heading for somewhere good. And I think this would create the opportunity to actually look at a more long-term sustainable arrangement that is both in the interest of the people who live in Gaza and want to live in peace and security, and for the Israelis who want to live in peace and security on both sides. I remember that maybe the first time I went to Sderot was probably in 2008 or 2009. And the then mayor of Sderot showed me this room in which he was collecting the various forms of rockets and leftovers that are coming out of Gaza. Now, this situation with rocket attacks and everything that comes along with that, and the latest with the balloons, has been going for too long. And it certainly needs to stop. It's not in the interest of anyone. It's not in the interest of Israelis, not in the interest of Palestinians.
So let's then transition. You sort of paved the way from the immediate coronavirus to the politics and the prospects. Several months ago, Nikki, as you know better than just about anyone, President Trump launched his new peace plan. Is there a peace process to speak of today? If so, what can you tell us about it? And if not, why not?
Well, there is no peace process. And honestly, I'm very doubtful that a peace process could be brought together the same way that it was done in the past. It would certainly have to be done with a different approach. But what remains the same is the problems. And the problems are that you have the Israeli people on one side who want to live in a Jewish state, and the Palestinian people who want to have a state of their own. So certainly in my mind, the only legitimate way out of this conflict remains a two-state solution. And certainly if you look at various UN resolutions and international agreements and bilateral agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians, there's plenty of reference points there for what that negotiation should look like. Now, part of the problem today is that the Palestinians have rejected the Trump proposal. The Israelis have accepted it, more or less, the Trump proposal, but there's no mechanism, there's no mediation mechanism currently in place that actually brings all the parties together. In the past, this used to be the United States, and the United States would sit with Israelis and with the Palestinians and with the others, with the internationals, and particularly within the quartet where you bring in the European Union, the Russians, and the UN, and mediate between the two sides. So our current challenge is to, one, recreate a mediation mechanism that actually keeps the Americans in, keeps the Palestinians at the table, and the Israelis, and the other factors, and maybe actually enlarges this group to also include the Arabs from the region, because they are increasingly playing a more critical role than perhaps in the past. And second, so recreating a mediation mechanism, and secondly, agreeing on what is the framework, what's the reference framework for the negotiation to take place. And our approach, from the UN's perspective, from the Secretary General's perspective, myself and our teams, is that this reference framework remains what is referred to as the internationally recognized legitimate reference framework, enshrined in a number of UN resolutions and in bilateral agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, in this environment, it is very difficult, obviously, because of the coronavirus, to deal with these issues. You can't deal with them on Zoom. Very difficult. You have to have meetings, and it's very difficult to have them right now. In fact, I came back, many of you would have been at the APAC conference this year. I got on a flight in Washington, landed in Tel Aviv, and was told that I have to go into quarantine. So since then, the quarantine for me has started. But one of the last people that I saw before leaving was Jared and the US team. And we had a very, very detailed and in-depth discussion on how to take this process forward. I think it's very important to make sure that the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Arabs are at the table. And I'm really, really hoping that as soon as we see some relaxation in the current limitations, we will be able to travel and to start re-engaging. Now we have a new government in Israel. That presents some challenges, presents some opportunities. We have received already, I think, 2 or 3 letters from the Palestinians outlining their approach. And that also presents some challenges and some opportunities. We're constantly talking to the Europeans, to the Russians, to the US. But again, it's a challenge to do this on Zoom. We have to start having more personal meetings.
So, Nikki, just a couple more questions before, Daniel, I turn it back to you and the questions from our audience. Well, let's begin with the Israelis. And you know that AJC has been deeply committed to our relationship with Israel and the search for peace. But many Israelis have lost hope and the possibilities of peace over many years, Nikki. You've heard the argument a number of times that every effort from the Barak effort to the Olmert effort has been either rejected or ignored, that the withdrawal from Gaza meant Hamas entry, the withdrawal from southern Lebanon meant Hezbollah's domination of the region. And Israel, in many ways, has kind of moved on and no longer believes that there really is a partner and time cannot stand still. Moreover, that the Palestinian Authority does not control Gaza, so you have a division within the Palestinians. And finally, that there is no succession process. So even if you were to sign a deal today with Mahmoud Abbas, for argument's sake, who's going to replace him? Will it be a smooth transfer of power, or will it be a messy transfer of power? So what is your message, if I may, Nikki, to the Israeli people in the face of this kind of mindset among so many? Why should they believe in the prospect of peace today?
Thanks, David. I sympathize with everything you've said because I hear this and I see this in my daily interactions with Israelis who pretty much everybody believes that any arrangement about peace, any process ends up with another intifada and violence, and nothing good comes out of it. If I cross the line and talk to the other side, I see pretty much the same, if not worse, desperation and loss of hope among ordinary Palestinians, who practically all of them believe that any peace process leads to more loss for them as well. Ordinary Palestinians want peace as much as Israelis. And if you recognize that there are challenges on both sides of the table for getting to a successful negotiation, these challenges are immense. You're right, Gaza has been under the control of Hamas for more than a decade now, and it's not been under the control of the legitimate Palestinian leadership. Effectively, the Palestinians have not been able to organize elections for more than a decade now. Legislative elections, presidential elections, there are huge difficulties in that. On the other side, you look at developments in Israel, and throughout this period, many on the Palestinian side see the settlements expand. All of us see the settlements expand, and land simply disappearing. So if you can make a long list of challenges that need to be addressed. Back in 2006, together with the US, this was under the previous administration, the Russians and the Europeans, we produced a very short document called the Quartet Report. I still think it's worth looking at it even today. It looked at it pretty much admitted that it's impossible to now bring the Israelis and the Palestinians together to the table, but it looked at what are the conditions that are necessary to be created by both sides. What does each side need to do? What does the international community need to do to be able to create conditions that make negotiations possible. And I think that there's plenty of that to be done on both ends. And really, it is very, very important for me to see how we can get back into a credible process, not just a process for the sake of having a process, but a credible process. Because despite the skepticism, despite the loss of hope, practically everyone wants to live in peace. Nobody wants to go back to a situation, or let's say the majority of people do not want to go back to a situation where violence prevails. We remember back again, when was it, 2016, 17, the stabbings happening all over Israel and the West Bank and elsewhere. Even before that, the intifadas, the terror attacks, nobody wants to go back to that. So we need to find a way to a credible arrangement that allows both sides to see their interests preserved and upheld. Otherwise, the loss of hope will prevail. And that's where my real concern is. Let me just, sorry, I don't want to drag this out too much, but just try and imagine a very brief example. If you happen to live in a Palestinian village in what in 1994 was Area B of the West Bank, so effectively under Palestinian civilian but Israeli security control. Fast forward to today, and somebody steals your car. There's no police station there responsible for your, to help you find your car. If you walk out of your village, the first person you will probably see is an IDF outpost protecting a settlement. They're not going to start looking for your vehicle. This it's such a frustration with ordinary people that once they believe that there's no hope for anything more than just getting a bit of a salary and living a quiet life, it's very easy for them to get radicalized. And this is where I think beyond the COVID environment and everything else that we see is the urgency of recreating a process, bringing a leadership back together that actually shows hope to people and limits the risk of radicalization.
So, Nikki, thank you for that. My final question, though, I wish we had hours and hours to continue. But Daniel, I want you to be ready, please, with your questions. Again, from the perspective of Israel, even from those who are most ardently in favor of a two-state agreement, and AJC, again, has been part of that search for an enduring two-state agreement. The big question, Nikki, is how do you prevent a failed Palestinian state? What are your thoughts about how to avoid a failed Palestinian state should we, in fact, reach a two-state agreement?
Well, you have to have in place credible security arrangements between Israel and its neighbors, and this is in the interest of everyone, credible security arrangements that actually last. And we've seen that with peace with Egypt and with peace with Jordan, in both cases, such credible security arrangements have functions. I think actually the Palestinians in a far stronger and a far better position, because they live very closely, obviously, with the Israelis, that the level of security coordination over the years that has emerged has already been, is very extensive and positive, particularly as far as the West Bank is concerned. Currently, we've seen various agreements in the past in which the Palestinians have accepted the fact that Israel will have to have some form of security responsibility. We have plans from previous negotiations that have looked in details of how this can be arranged, and to guarantee that you have credible national institutions that are democratic, that serve the interests of the people, that are not corrupt. Well, you have to have a state for that. Without having a state for that, you always can blame everything on someone else. And I see a lot of this blaming happening here all the time. There's always somebody else responsible for things that can be resolved by one or the other party. And look at the situation now. Hamas took over Gaza more than a decade ago. That has become one of the main reasons why the Palestinians can't have elections. But not having elections means that their own legislative council doesn't function. Now, that is not in the interest of peace. It is not in the interests of the Israelis. It is not in the interest of the Palestinians. In fact, September last year, President Abbas came to the UN and said he wants to have elections. And we helped him put in place various arrangements to make that election possible. And the one outstanding issue that was left was whether Israel would allow vote in West Jerusalem for the Palestinians there. Hopefully, we were supposed to return to that issue once a new government in Israel is formed. And now that the new government is possibly coming together, we will have to address that. But if you have functioning institutions, if you have good security coordination, if you have meaningful arrangements with your neighbors, yes, you can prevent that radicalization, because the other alternative is not having a state, not having hope for the future, and that is what actually breeds the radicalization more than anything else.
Nikki, thank you for that. And by the way, as you promised, your clock has not moved, though we've spoken for the last half an hour, and it's intriguing to me. The clock has now vanished. Daniel, back to you, please, for questions from our audience.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, and thank you, Mr. Mladenov. And that clock will be right eventually if we're able to get to every single one of these questions. So our first question comes from Janice Ellen in Atlanta. She asks, I know that it's very difficult to predict the future, but what is your assessment as to the change in the mindset of the Palestinian on the street with regard to Israel's assistance, both medically and financially? Do you think whatever positives there are will last beyond the pandemic?
Excellent question. However, I'm not sure how to answer that, because what we have now is really the common thread of the pandemic bringing everyone together to work against it. But we also see some political moves on the horizon that are very, very worrying. And I'm referring particularly to the agreement within the Israeli coalition to move ahead with annexation of parts of the West Bank. Now, if that were to happen, and we've been very clear to everybody, including yesterday, on all sides of the equation here, if that move were to happen, it would certainly undermine a lot of the good possibilities that are now emerging through the common fight against the virus. It would certainly go against international law and prompt various reactions in Europe and elsewhere. And to me, strategically, from a longer term perspective, it would undermine the chances of normalizing relations between Israel and the rest of the Middle East. So when you have this budding common realization that we have to fight a common enemy, which is the virus, and it's just beginning. It's only been a few weeks where we've really had this realization globally, let alone just here in the Middle East. That can be very easily knocked off by a big move like annexation. And we're quite concerned by that, because that would certainly not be helpful to anyone, not be helpful to Israelis, not to Palestinians, and certainly not to peace.
Our next question comes from Ilan Selby from the European Union of Jewish Students in Brussels. What are your views on the U.S. role as a peace broker to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How do you believe that the U.S. role as a broker has evolved since the 1991 Madrid conference? And is there any hope of peace when the relationship between the current U.S. administration and the Palestinian leadership is as it is now?
The U.S., you can make peace just with the U.S., and you can't make peace without the U.S. And I think it is very, very important to restore the relationship between the American administration, the United States, and the Palestinians. Because if we're able to do that, that strengthens the U.S. mediation role. It enhances the ability of other actors, the United Nations, the Europeans, the Russians, the Arabs, to play a constructive role. And that's why I think, focusing on what is the process that brings everybody back to the table is so important. We live in a very strange world for many, many reasons, but just sitting here in Jerusalem, I've come to the realization that one of the strange environments which we have today is that a lot of people have stopped talking to each other. The Americans and the Palestinians don't talk to each other. The Fatah and Hamas don't talk to each other. If you look at the region, it gets even more complicated. And for me as the representative of the Secretary General here and for the role of the UN, it is vitally important to be able to bring everyone back to the table. Why do I say we can't do it without the US? Because the US is critically important for Israel. It is a strong partner for Israel. It is a strong supporter to Israel, and it is the one party outside of the two sides of the conflict that can work very, very closely with the Israelis, but was also able to work with the Palestinians in the past very, very closely as well, because of the assistance that they were providing, because of the engagement through the quartet and other things. I think it's important to restore that. Why can't you do it just with the US? Because you need Europe, you need the Russians, and you need the Arabs. Without bringing everyone back into the table, we will not be able to move forward.
Thank you. We have several questions along the same lines with regards to annexation that you just answered several of them in your answer a few moments ago. Some of our questions coming from AJC Honorary President John Shapiro of New York and Susie from Maryland, Chaim from Boston, so I can go on. But I'll ask this question, which is, Israel annexed the Golan Heights and then had serious discussions with Syria in the early 2000s about returning the territory in exchange for peace. With that in mind, is annexation really such a fatal blow to the peace process?
I think it is a devastating blow to the peace process, because there hasn't been a peace process for a long time. We've seen a lot of unilateral actions happen during this period. Israelis and Palestinians have drifted apart big time over the last decade, and to me, the main risk is what David opened with in the beginning: the loss of hope. If ordinary people in the West Bank or in Gaza see that there is no hope for having a state, they see their land disappear, they see blockage internationally on the negotiations, they see no prospect of achieving their legitimate goals through negotiations, they can very easily become prey to radicalism. And I say this with having quite a number of years of now experience in the region, not just here, but in other parts of the region, in Iraq and elsewhere. The loss of hope, the loss of perspective really, really drives people to religious extremism. And that is going to be destructive for everyone. If today the Israelis and the Palestinians were to say together, look, we realize that our politics are not in a place where we can sit down and negotiate. However, we agree that we have to preserve the prospect of a two-state solution. And here's a list of things that both sides can do to preserve that prospect. Stop settlement expansion, stop violence, bring the PA back into control of Gaza, organize elections. A lot of these things happening, they would expand the space for negotiations and for peace, and they would ultimately, in the future, create the conditions where leaders can come together and negotiate. Otherwise, if you assume that you can do things only unilaterally on either side, that's just going to keep driving both sides apart more and more.
Before I ask this next question, I just want to remind our viewers that AJC is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. So with that in mind, if by any chance there is a change in the administration in the US in November, what will this mean to the peace process?
Sorry, can you ask the question again? Because
Sure. If there's a change in administration in the US, what will that mean for the peace process?
I don't know. That would be very speculative to say at this point, because we need to see how the election in America will unfold. If there's a change of administration, what will be the policies of the new administration? Certainly, It would probably, whether it would endorse the plan that the Trump administration has put forward, their proposal or not. So it would be very speculative for me to go down that road. What we need to see, I think, currently is that the understanding that given where we are because of COVID-19, because of a lot of other factors in the region, we shouldn't make the situation worse. We should prevent it from deteriorating further, whether it's in Gaza or elsewhere, and build the conditions for meaningful negotiations in the future. I think that's where we currently are.
Our next question comes from Paul in Florida, who asks, is there any realistic alternative to a US brokered negotiation, an international conference, another country taking the lead, an Arab-led effort, and frankly, given the political divisions among Palestinians and the justified wariness of Israelis, is any sort of negotiation even conceivable?
That's one of the issues that we're grappling with, because until now, the assumption has been that the mediators for the conflict are the quartet, which includes the US, the Europeans, the Russians, and the UN. But as I said in the beginning, I think it's time to actually look a little bit beyond that because of the specific role that the Arab countries are now playing, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, others, and strengthen their participation perhaps in the mediation effort. The US, will always play one of the most, if not the most important role in such a grouping, but it can't be the only one. Because you need a group of entities that are able to negotiate, to provide credible support to both parties, and in achieving an agreement, to insulate both parties, if you wish, from the risk of radicals outside, because there'll be plenty of entities out there who will want to destroy such a peace negotiation, to finance peace and the benefits of that in the future. To guarantee politically that whatever the agreements are reached will be recognized, endorsed, and legally protected internationally. So that's why you need a group of entities or countries together, and that group has to include the US. Yeah.
Daniel, could I step in here to ask a follow-up question, please, to you, Nikki? Several years ago, there was a kind of evolving negotiating thought that the Palestinians were politically unable to move the process forward on their own from their side, but that the growing engagement with Israel by major Arab countries, not just Egypt and Jordan, but you mentioned Saudi Arabia, one can add the UAE, Bahrain, Oman, perhaps Morocco from a distance, could begin to change the dynamic, where rather than simply follow the Palestinians blindly at Arab League meetings or UN meetings, they could begin to sort of take over the process. In reality, has that happened to any extent, Nikki? Could it happen, or is it an unrealistic way to think about going forward?
It's definitely not an unrealistic way to look forward, but it is an equation that needs to include the Palestinians as well. What we've seen throughout the history of this conflict, including in the last couple of years, is that whenever the Palestinians are leading their own file on behalf of the Arabs, and if the Palestinians do not agree to any settlement or any arrangement that is legitimate, it is not possible for the Arabs to jump over them and to reach an agreement that doesn't recognize their legitimate rights. And I don't think they should be expected to do that. But where the role of the Arabs is extremely important is in putting forward proposals and putting forward a vision that actually says, you know what, we're all here in this region to stay. Israel, its neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, everyone. We are all facing a threat of, radical Islam, radicalization. We're all facing social issues, not let alone the COVID virus right now. Facing social issues that we need to address. We need to look to the future at what are the benefits of peace for everybody. So therefore, working together, we can achieve much more than working against each other. And I see already a lot of that cooperation emerge, particularly as far as security issues are concerned. If you look at the threat assessments coming out of many Arab countries and Israel as well, they're very similar. So you can see similarities along that end. You can see similarities in terms of how a number of countries identify the risks for the future, be they economic or political, etc. So that's why I think it's extremely important to find a credible way forward on resolving the Palestinian question, so that these benefits can be brought in. And in my mind, one way of doing that, or one part of doing that, is actually bringing the Arab countries more to the table in the negotiating process, so that they're not just sitting there outside waiting, but they're intimately involved in the discussion, in the discussions on the Palestinian side, on the Palestinian question. And perhaps this can be a game changer. Of course, it's very difficult to that's again why I go back to the question of annexation. If annexation were to happen, it would make that more difficult as well. But on the positive side, COVID-19, terrorism, threats in the region, bringing everyone together, that's been a positive driving factor. We need to get back to those discussions rather than discussions that separate everyone.
I just wanted to add, Daniel, before giving it back to you, that Nikki, as you know, AJC travels extensively in the Arab world, and we have for now 30 years, often quietly. And the evolution that some of us have seen has gone from direct engagement with the Palestinian question to, frankly, increasing indifference to the Palestinian question, a kind of frustration, which is certainly not expressed publicly. It's not expressed in voting in the UN General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, but privately there's a kind of frustration. We can't move the Palestinians, and we don't want to be held hostage to the Palestinian question because we have other interests with Israel. Is there truth in that observation? And if so, how can one change the perception in order to engage the Arab countries more seriously with the Palestinian question and the search for peace?
Well, David, think about what you just said. If we'd had this discussion, 20 years ago, peace in the Middle East was about peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And today, peace in the Middle East is about peace in Yemen, peace in Syria, peace in Lebanon, peace in Iraq, peace in Libya, long list. So a lot of the, it's a little bit understandable why a lot of the attention in the Arab world has moved away from the single issue of the Palestinian file to a lot of other conflicts that have happened since the last couple of decades. That attention has been shifted. It has shifted resources, obviously, as well, but and political capital has been invested in a lot of other issues. But the fact of the matter remains that if you look at just a couple of, when was it, a year ago, when the US moved its embassy in Jerusalem or stopped funding UNRWA. Let's look at the stop funding UNRWA bit in particular. The Arabs were the ones who came in to fund UNRWA since then. UNRWA is still struggling for its financing, but a lot of the money that saved the organization and its work came from the Gulf, from exactly the same countries that today continue to recognize that, yes, indeed, with Israel, they share common interests and common ideas for the future, but still that doesn't mean that they give up on the people, the Palestinian people. And another reason is that nobody sees a credible process these days. So if you look around and our work is very lonely these days, running around and talking about the Palestinians and the Israelis and the need for peace and this and that. It's not a fun job to do on a daily basis, because it is lonely. Attention's shifted elsewhere. But if I assure you that if we're able to create a process that looks credible and that looks meaningful, attention will come back, and it should come back in a much more constructive manner than before, precisely because of these opportunities that you were referring to. I think that's why I spent I did spend in the old world a lot of my time traveling to these countries and talking to them constantly about the issues here and the linkages between, the problems here and elsewhere, be they in the Sinai, be they in Syria, be they in Lebanon, be they in Iraq or elsewhere. So I think there's a real opportunity. We just have to have the willingness of the political leadership to get there.
Thank you. Daniel, back to you.
Sure, we have time for one final question, and we have several questions along the same lines, including from David Chaffetz, an AJC board member in Sarasota, Florida. You have been great on these issues, but given UN history on this conflict, can the UN really be an impartial broker?
Well, talking about the UN is like speaking on behalf of the universe or the planet. There's so many different, parts of the UN. My team and I work with the Secretary General. There's the General Assembly. There are different organizations within the UN system who have different mandates. I think that what all unites us and what all brings us together is actually the hope that we can actually be helpful to peace. Our role as the Secretary General's office, myself and our teams, is to actually focus on the political aspect of it and to engage with everybody to prevent war, prevent escalation, focus on preventive diplomacy, and bring people together. And sometimes, we not sometimes, but very often we work with our colleagues on the development front who help, whether it's the Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank, deal with humanitarian issues, with social issues, with state building. But, to say, well, the whole UN, can it be an honest broker? You don't want, 130 odd countries sitting in the room as honest brokers with a secretariat and all of its staff. You need the key countries. And again, you need the Americans, you need the Russians, you need the Europeans, and you need the Secretary General and his offices and the Arabs. So yes, we can help. We can work quietly and assist. But we have to work also within the limitations that are created by the member states.
David, back to you. I think we're just out of time.
Okay. Well, I think my friend David Chaffetz really framed the last question very well, and it's really the way I wanted to end, because many of us who follow the UN are sometimes quite unhappy with UN, and for good reason. But it's important to understand that, like many, the UN is a complex institution. And what Nickolay Mladenov is trying to do in his very fair-minded, engaged approach is quite different, say, than the member states sitting in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council and robotically, automatically criticizing Israel day after day after day with a permanent agenda item. So Nikki, on behalf of the American Jewish Committee, I want to thank you not just for spending the last hour with us and not just being our friend for well over a decade. And I can't even count the number of times we've met in so many different places, but for your very earnest, sincere, genuine efforts to try and advance Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab engagement, cooperation, leading to the prospects of an enduring two-state agreement. So for that, thank you. And in my very, very limited Bulgarian, Mnogo blagodarya, which means, I believe, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
Did I get the Bulgarian right?
You got it perfectly well. You've had experience.
Daniel?
Thank you, David, and thank you very much, Mr. Mladenov. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. To support AJC's vital work around the world, please visit ajc.org/donate. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Goodbye.